This video is sponsored by Crippled God Foundry. There is a secret trick to paint faster, better miniatures that you have totally ignored because you thought you knew better. Today, let's talk about the secret color wheel, why what you taught was wrong, and how you can use this to paint faster miniatures. Let's break it down. The color wheel that you grew up with is wrong, which you actually probably already suspected. We grew up thinking red, yellow, and blue are our primary colors from which all other colors can be mixed. And while mixing yellow and blue does get green and yellow and red does create orange, mixing red and blue doesn't actually create purple. Now there is a bunch of history as to why red, blue, and yellow are the primary colors that we have been taught, and science as to how you can actually get red and blue to make purple, but for simplicity's sake, it just doesn't work. The better, more accurate color wheel for painters is actually the CMY color wheel, which stands for Cyan, Magenta, and Yellow. This color wheel was originally designed to be used in printing. For us, the short answer for why the CMY color wheel is best is because when mixed, the primary colors of Cyan, Magenta, and Yellow actually create all the other colors we could need. But how does this help us paint faster? In short, understanding these true primary colors can help us create 3 no-fail color schemes: Magenta and Yellow, Cyan and Yellow, and Cyan, Magenta, and Yellow. Today, we are focusing on Cyan and Yellow and Cyan, Magenta, and Yellow. Okay, but how are these no-fail color schemes? Basically, our chosen colors plus black and white are the only colors we will be working with for each model. When using only your chosen colors and using those colors to mix any other color you might need, you are assuring that the model will be cohesive as a whole. Today, we are talking about the fastest way to use this knowledge by painting with an airbrush, though a dry brush would also work. I will talk about how to use these same ideas on a more detailed model next week. Okay, let's get into it. I'm starting by basing both of my models in a deep dark cyan, created by mixing a green leaning blue with black and then applying it all over the model. Cyan can be tricky to find within miniature paints, but know you are looking for a greenish blue. Teal or even jade will work just fine. If I were doing a magenta and yellow color scheme, I would base in a deep, dark magenta. Let's talk cyan, magenta, yellow. I'm spraying a pure magenta from above in a wide sweeping motion, aiming from the top of the model while wrapping the paint around the vertical surfaces of the model, applying the paint lightly around the edges and focusing more on the top half of the model. This allows my magenta to slowly build up from a rich purple to a purer magenta. To achieve a brighter, more intense magenta, I'm adding a bit of white to my airbrush. White is a great way to add opacity to any color. This time around, I'm only hitting the top half of the model. I don't want to erase those purple gradients I created, but we want to give enough opacity for the yellow to show up on nicely. You can see how the magenta and cyan have mixed to create a far more exciting gradation than one might expect from just applying 2 colors. Finally is my yellow. I'm using yellow from Ultra Krill because of how amazingly opaque it is. However, adding some yellow ink or yellow speed paint to gain some transparency would have led to an even smoother gradation from the magenta to yellow. I'm giving a general layer of yellow over the top, aiming directly downwards, then giving extra attention to the most important element of the model. For this miniature, I'm wrapping the yellow down around the front of the model to hit more of the face. Using cyan as my shadow, magenta as my midtone, and yellow as my highlight has created this really interesting color gradient in almost no time at all. Instead of focusing on creating a cohesive color through a dozen smaller individual choices, I have instead chosen a color scheme and created more of an atmosphere for the model as a whole, allowing the airbrush to do all of the blending for me. Let's take a minute to talk about this week's sponsor, Crippled God Foundry. I've worked with Crippled God Foundry for years, and their models are always fantastic. This month, Crippled God Foundry has their anniversary, and they're celebrating with 2 exciting releases, plus a free anniversary gift to their supporters. October's release is Horrors of the Far Realm, focusing on mind flayers. This matches perfectly with their anniversary release, Eldritch Horrors, which includes 30 Cthulhu-themed monsters as well as a Necronomicon. Also, for the first time ever, Crippled God Foundry is releasing a sci-fi realm release, which includes scientifically enhanced soldiers, 5 pieces of terrain, and more. If you love highly detailed miniatures, interesting terrain, as well as 5e compatible adventure modules and stat blocks, then Crippled God Foundry is for you. Check out all of their releases following the link in my description box. Thanks so much, back to painting. Since I have my airbrush pulled out, let's go over the Cyan and Yellow. I'm taking my yellow airbrush and applying it over the top of my cyan base. Again, using a 50-50 mixture of my pure opaque yellow and a yellow contrast paint or ink would have given me better end results. Unfortunately, I applied my yellow too broadly and too opaquely instead of aiming straight from above and applying the yellow with a very light hand, like I did on the last model. Because of this, I've lost my blue and gradation of green. Instead, it looks like just a snot yellow. To fix this, I'm taking a cyan ink and spraying it from below onto the underside of the model to re-intensify that blue. This is a great way to fix any mistakes you might make while working with the CMY color wheel with an airbrush. If you feel like you've lost too much of one of your colors, you can just apply more of it with an ink or contrast paint. Since these colors are all designed to mix together, you should always achieve a beautiful result. Really, the goal of all of this is to create a complex base of colors. We want the airbrush to do the majority of the work so that then we can just touch it up later with a paintbrush. Speaking of, onto the brush. On my first model, the airbrush has left us with a really interesting gradient. The brighter yellow shoulders, orange stomach, and thighs down to blue feet are exactly what I wanted. However, it's not as cohesive as it could be. I'm going over the top half of the model with Carabrid Crimson Wash from Citadel. This is dulling down the colors, but also melds all of my colors together while giving a more universal shadow color. I'm using this reddish wash because it is the middle color between my cyan shadow and yellow highlight. If I were to use a wash with my cyan to yellow or magenta to yellow model, I would choose a wash in that midtone respectively. Then I'm using Drakenhof Nightshade, again a wash from Citadel, on the bottom half of the model to keep it cold and darker. An easy way to cheat in miniature painting is to paint the bottom half of the model darker so as not to draw attention to it, allowing us to spend more time on the more interesting and more important parts of the miniature. Let's dry brush. I'm starting with orange to pull back that saturation we lost with the wash, applying it over the top half of the model with a light hand. This will create a smoother gradient between my magenta and yellow. Then I'm onto a yellow with an even lighter hand. Even though I'm recreating the same gradient that I created with the airbrush, the model looks much more intense and interesting than it was before. Next, I'm scrumbling on a thick glaze consistency mixture of a buttery yellow and my vibrant yellow. Using this glaze consistency will help me continue the smooth gradient I created with the airbrush and soft dry brush. Since the face is my focus for this model, I really only need to focus on the head and shoulders. Next, I'm using that buttery yellow on the teeth. The most important thing about creating good miniatures is contrast. I'm adding a glaze of magenta into the little recesses, like the hollows of the collarbones, the side of his face, and in between his muscles. The more layers I apply, the darker those areas will appear. So I'm layering them up in smaller and smaller areas with each application to create a gradient of less intense to more intense magenta. Lastly, I'm taking my butter yellow and using the side of my brush, highlighting details on the upper body for emphasis. The face area, the collarbones, and the shoulders. Don't overdo it, less is more. Back to the hound. I'm using a thinned down cyan ink to paint in extra contrast in the recesses of the model, just like before. Then to make this creepier, I'm adding my thinned magenta to the joints of this creature, as those areas are frequently red due to the thin skin over blood vessels. Lastly, it's painting the mouth and then scrumbling with that same butter yellow glaze from before. Using these NoFail color schemes has helped create this vibrant and intense models that look like they took way more time than they actually did. The secret is to use colors that always mix together beautifully, and using messy glazes to slowly build up color. The point of this technique isn't to be precise, but to embrace the use of color and focus more on highlighting the areas of importance and shading areas we don't spend as much time on. Embrace the chaos and focus on having fun. But what if you want to paint something that has a lot more detail, like a character model? I'll talk about how to paint that in next week's video. Thanks so much, you know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe, go join me on Patreon. Thanks so much, I'll see you next time.